Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome back to another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Today, I'm sitting down with Paul Galloway, Senior Advisor here at Strategic Treasurer. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Thanks, Brian.
Today, we are talking about why Treasury projects stall internally. And Paul, what does typically cause projects to stall? And is there a particular point in projects when they typically stall?
That's a great question. I could spend probably quite a bit of time on this topic, but for this podcast, I'm going to keep it to some of the more common things that I've seen on projects I've worked on. I've worked on a lot of projects in my career. One piece that always seems to come up with any project I've been on is scope creep. Scope creep tends to slow down a project, and in some cases it can stall a project just based on what the client is needing or wanting and what you agreed to in a contract. And so that can be problematic or challenging at times. So trying to manage scope creep and what you're actually doing requires some time and effort. While it does, it's better to work on that and manage that closely so that your project isn't getting slowed down or stalled. The other one that I want to hit on is around unexpected challenges to system connectivity. So anytime we have connectivity projects, whether we're connecting banks to an aggregator or treasury management system or something else, perhaps connectivity to ERP or an admin system or vice versa, we see from time to time there can be challenges depending on the type of connectivity that you're engaging in and the file formats that are going to be utilized. That can present some challenges around making sure you have the right file format, the naming convention of the files. That naming convention can prevent a file from being accepted and uploaded into a system. The file format, the way it's coming in, if it's missing or has something that it shouldn't have in the file format, that can create a problem as well, where file can fail. Getting information out of one of your treasury technologies, whether it's a TMS or a treasury aggregator, to feed into, in particular, your ERP, all the accounting information at the transactional level. Sometimes that can be a challenge to get it from system into, TMS or aggregator into the ERP. That takes some time to get all that figured out sometimes, and it can stall a project, in particular on the accounting side. More often than not, we do see that accounting is a challenge, and it's really important that organizations have the accounting component, because what you're doing is you're taking oftentimes a lot of manual processes on the accounting side, and you're working on automating that so that you don't have people manually doing journal entries or reconciling on a non-automated basis. We like to see bank transactions being reconciled daily. It helps with fraud protection. So being able to address those unexpected challenges is super important. The other thing that we see within organizations, in particular of size, is around competing priorities within the organization. And so whether it's a business unit or a function that supports the business writ large, like Treasury, there's leaders that are competing for a finite level of capital that's available for the projects they have. And so sometimes competing priorities can slow a project down where funds are being diverted to something else that's deemed as a higher priority than what your project may be. Another one that we see quite often is around staff changes, and we end up having several clients that have been faced with staff changes. It's somebody unexpectedly retires or moves on, or several people within a team leave, and it leaves a huge gap, and organizations need staffing on a temporary basis. When that happens, typically projects will definitely stall. They'll stop, they'll put a temporary pause on it, and they'll wait till the new leader and team gets in place before they ramp it back up. I've had that happen mid-project before, and it really slowed down the project big time. And so we did stall out for a period of time. And it was a challenge to get it back up and running again, because your new leader is trying to get lay of the land and then prioritize things the way they feel they should be prioritized, while at the same time the competing priorities in an organization are still happening. And so another priority can come in and take place, which could prevent the project from restarting right away. And then the last one that is perhaps less common, unless you're an organization that does a lot of this, is around mergers and acquisitions. Organizations can go out and buy and sell companies or merge with other companies. Integration can be a huge challenge when something like this happens, and you're trying to figure out where the redundant systems are and people and processes, and trying to get some synergy around combining the two organizations. And so you recognize that over time you're not going to need two TMS platforms, two ERPs, or other systems that you're utilizing. And you're going to want to get down to perhaps a single platform, unless you're truly doing just a bolt-on acquisition. You're letting them stand alone while you still own them, but you allow them to stand alone and operate that way. But oftentimes M&A tends to be a slower of projects, sometimes a staller.
What might be some internal dynamics that could block or would block a project's progress with leadership and key stakeholders?
Yeah, I talked about competing priorities before. And, these tend to be major roadblocks, because competition for that finite level of capital or cash to do a project in a given year sometimes can be challenging. It can be flexible in terms of who's going to get what and when. And so the competing priorities tend to be a big roadblock. And it's a dynamic that within an organization you have to be aware of. And you need to make sure that you are out there marketing, for lack of a better term, marketing the value of your project that you're wanting to do, and why it's a key priority to focus on for the year that you're working on the project. So that's one area. Another one is when you get disengaged project team. It may be the entire team. It could be members of the team that purposely or not purposely trying to slow a project down. It may be that they don't have interest in it. Maybe they have a priority that they deem as a better priority than another, kind of the competing priority standpoint. But if you have a team where there's disengagement, that will definitely be a challenge that you need to be aware of as a leader. How do you manage that? How do you get your folks motivated? How do you keep delivering the message of the value and why it's important to them and the organization? You need to understand that, and you have to have the ability to communicate that and get the disengaged re-engaged. I kind of alluded to the next one in what I just said a little bit, and this is around dissenters. You have people that just flat out are saying, I'm not going to do this. They're not budging, they're not wanting to move, they're not cooperating. Dissenters can be a huge challenge to projects and the ability to complete a project on time or complete it at all. So dissenters, you got to understand who's dissenting, why are they dissenting, and how can you get them engaged. That can be a big challenge. You may not be able to do it, but being aware that this is something that could happen, a dynamic that could block the project, being able to understand these things ahead of time and making sure that the team members you have included, the team stakeholders, that they understand the value, you communicate on a regular basis and keep them engaged. Another one could be around cash flow or revenue stress, perhaps a capital shortfall. If these kinds of things happen within an organization, then what you tend to see happening is that an organization will pull back on a project. They may potentially mothball it, so it's completely stalled, or they may slow it down and say, all right, you know what, you're going to take a pause, we're going to come back to it at this point, or they could just, completely stop it, where it's not even stalled, it's just they've said, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. So you need to understand if you run into cash flow, revenue stress, or capital shortfall, that could have an impact on your project. The last one would be around, and I talked about this earlier, business expansion, whether it's organic or through M&A, capital that's needed to develop products and services or to purchase another organization tend to have priority because that's how you generate revenue. And so it's this revenue versus expense kind of scenario. You need to understand that dynamic so that you can help manage it and contextualize what the value is. Oftentimes they want to hear about it in dollars and cents or time savings or both. So you have to be able to contextualize that and provide that to the business unit leaders, and your executive leadership to keep the project going. So those are some of the ones that I think are key when it comes to, roadblocks or things you should be aware of that could stall your project.
Okay, let's say I'm a treasurer. I have a project that has stalled. How should I frame that project for executives?
This is a great question because there's a couple different approaches you could take to it. So the first one I think is, be transparent on what's impacted the project. Make sure that you communicate that clearly, what those challenges are, what you feel it's going to take to remove the impediment, reduce the impact, and get the project moving, get it on track. So you're going to have really good communication and the ability to influence your leadership to get the project out of being stalled back to normal cadence. Now, to do that, you need to share actionable approaches to getting the project on track. Okay, here's what we need to do. Here's the timeline I think that it's going to take to get this back on track, and report on that. So you have to have a level of accountability so that plan with accountability, they're going to expect that. And you're going to have to communicate back to them on a regular basis where things are at. I've done this quite often as both a practitioner and with strategic treasurer working on projects. It's something that you just have to stay on top of. You need accountability. You need to have a plan. The other thing, I kind of talked about this earlier, but the other thing that I think is really important is you need to continue to share the benefits of continuing along with the plan and making sure that you communicate what those benefits are as you continue to move forward. You get a win in the project. It may be that you have a project that's kind of phased in nature, and you can start doing things as you hit certain milestones. Communicating that to your leadership, I think, is really valuable. It reinforces the overall benefits that the organization is going to receive from that particular project.
Okay, and wrapping up, regarding projects that have been stalled for a long time, can they be restarted? And if so, how? What do I need to do as the treasurer to re-engage those and maybe breathe new life into them?
Yeah, this one is a very difficult dynamic to approach. It doesn't always work. However, it doesn't mean that you don't try. And sometimes it may take more effort to get it restarted. I think it really starts with a couple of what I consider to be key factors. One is you have to get leadership buy-in, which means you're going to have to talk about that timeline. You have to have a clear plan, a timeline, a cost associated with it, and the benefits and how you're going to ensure that you're going to be able to meet the deadline and the cost level that you've projected. So get that buy-in by leadership. So cost to restart, there is a cost to restart, because when you stop something completely, when it's been long stalled, it's essentially been stopped. Now you have to get your key stakeholders back together. You have to get your team back together. You have to get people re-engaged. So there's a certain level of cost associated with doing a restart. That should be communicated to the leadership team, especially your sponsor. If your sponsor's not buying into it, you're not going to get the rest of the executive team to buy in as well. So you need to be able to state what that cost to restart is. The next one is around the ability to execute. You have to have, one, the level of accountability, which kind of gives you the motivation to get things done. But you have to have the ability to execute. So you have to demonstrate that you can do that. So it's one thing to say, oh, I can do this. It's quite another thing to be able to actually do it. So some people are really good at saying, yeah, we can do this, we can do that. They can map it all out. But when it comes to execution, action is not their area of expertise. So ability to execute, it's on the project leader to do that, to ensure it. Doesn't mean everything's on them, but they're the one that's managing the project and is overall accountable for its success or failure. So you have to have the ability to execute on the plan. The final one is, I talked about key stakeholders earlier. I mentioned it on the cost to restart, because you have to re-engage your key stakeholders. Well, in order to get them re-engaged, you're going to have to make sure that you have their support, get their buy-in. And this is something that could be challenging. Depending on how long the project's been stalled, you could have one of a couple things happen. And I didn't mention this earlier, but it could happen that you have had a turnover in executive leadership. You've had a turnover in the key stakeholders that would support the project. So some folks will be totally starting from scratch potentially. That means there's more effort to get the restart going, but you have to have the key stakeholders bought in as well as your executive leadership team. If you don't have that, it's going to be very difficult to restart a long stalled project.
All right. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate being on here. Always a pleasure talking about these things.
Indeed. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. This is Brian Weeks. We'll talk to you next time.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.